Okay, so I'm starting off talking about what editors look for and where people submitting manuscripts go wrong. And let's just begin by understanding what scholarly publishing is. To a great extent, it is publishing done by scholars for other scholars. So why are manuscripts accepted for publication? Well, part of it, of course, is scholarly significance. When you're writing for other scholars, it's important that other scholars are going to get something from it. But also remember that scholarship is about the real world. And so the second thing that an editor is going to look for is real world significance. There are really two streams of research going on, actually in much of the world, but certainly across Asia. And one stream is what I'm calling here national academic publishing. Now, this is publishing that's done in Asian languages. And every country has local issues that are being discussed by scholars in the national language. So in Japan, there's a huge amount of scholarship done in Japanese, and scholarship in Chinese, scholarship in Indonesian, and so on. This scholarship doesn't make it very far outside of the country where it originates. It has its own set of literature. There are theories that people use. There's certain key concepts that turn up. And it's quite an important body of scholarship. And unfortunately, some of the topics would actually benefit people in other countries. But in fact, it doesn't reach them because of the language limitations, or in some cases it's published in English, but it's simply published in journals that don't make it outside the country of origin. Just use Indonesia as a case in point. A lot of Indonesian journals have switched from Indonesian to English. They're open access journals, but hardly anybody outside of Indonesia knows about them. So they're still only read, for the most part, within Indonesia. Then there is an international level of academic publishing, which is primarily done in English. The focus is on what I suppose I would call transnational issues. But there is a focal point of this in the US. People there control a lot of the journals and tend to define what qualifies as an important issue. There's a kind of global disciplinary approach. So if you talk to people, we've done this across East and Southeast Asia, and it's pretty obvious that a lot of the people we speak to, whatever country we're in, are thinking about their subject matter in a similar way. And they're writing for the same journals, they're writing for the same audience. And there is a literature, a set of theories, a set of key concepts that are used for this literature. So, why do people publish in English? Well, a lot of this has to do with the university ranking system. People are trying to publish in journals that appear in the major citation indexes. And they want to be in a journal with a high impact factor. And why do they want this? Well, primarily because their employer says you should want this. Well, this is what we want you to do because it's going to help the university achieve a higher international profile. Also, people want to build a personal reputation. To achieve a high H factor, if you haven't got an H factor, you write a few more articles and you will have one. It's a cumulative measure of the impact of an individual academic's articles over the years. Now, as an editor, what I would really like to ask just about every author who submits a manuscript either to the press or to a journal is, why did you write this piece? Because this is a question that has a right answer and a wrong answer. And the wrong answer is, because my university required it. And the right answer is simply, I have something to say, I have something to communicate. Well, that sounds pretty simple. But a lot of people, when they write papers, haven't really focused on what it is that they have to communicate. So let's look at what you need to write an article. You need a topic. Just one topic. An article is not very big. And too often I see an article where somebody is trying to cover 3 or 4 things and doing it all a bit badly because they're trying to do too much. Now, when you're talking about one topic, you can bring up other things, of course. But you have to focus on one issue, one topic that drives the article. You need a research question, and it needs to be a question that you can answer in the scope of an article. One of the things we're going to be asking you in the sessions in this workshop, what is your research question? Now, when I receive a manuscript, one of the first things I do is look at the abstract. Now, sometimes people actually put their question in the abstract. But at the very least, there should be something in that abstract that will let me identify what the research question is. So you tell me a fact, I can back it up and say, okay, that answers this question. I want to know the answer to your question. I want to know how you're supporting that answer. But beyond that, you also need a good presentation. And just to signal in advance, one of the things that's going to come up in this workshop, what makes a good presentation in an article written in Chinese is not necessarily the same as what makes a good presentation in an article in English. And the same is true of a lot of other languages, so nothing peculiar about Chinese in this. So this workshop is really about the presentation of manuscripts that are being submitted to English language, international, refereed publications. Okay, so every article answers a question. And every piece of research is all about answering questions. That's simply what research is. And pieces of research have to begin with factual questions. And you can dress it up any way you want to, make it sound very fancy, but it's fundamentally answering questions of fact: who, what, when, and where. And if you write an article answering one of those questions, there's a fairly good chance it will be rejected. Even as students, you quite likely run into some professor who has responded to your paper, your class paper, by saying, this is just description. Where's the analysis? Well, the analysis comes when you ask further questions. Questions about why something happened and how something happened. And if you answer the question of why or how, you probably have come up with an argument. And you need an argument at the heart of your article. So the answer to an analytical question, a why or a how question, is a claim or an argument. And then you have to support that. You have the article begins with the argument, you give your evidence, and that is the kind of thing an editor is going to look for. So what do editors want? I would guess if I asked that question around the room, all of you would get it wrong. You would probably be talking about new content, exciting concepts, and so on and so forth. But the fundamental thing every editor wants is readers. Because if we publish something that nobody reads, it's a waste of space, it's a waste of time and energy. So the critical thing for any editor, any publisher, is who is going to read this. So I'm the publishing director at NUS Press, and when we have meetings to discuss manuscripts, this is pretty much the first question. Who is going to be interested in this? Who is going to read this manuscript? So the next question, of course, is, well, what do readers want? If you're talking about journals, every journal will serve a particular audience, and they'll serve different audiences. Editors are going to select journals that suit the audience for the journal. So in order to get published, what you need to be doing is to write for a particular audience. Now, most of these audiences can be split into two parts. They're specialists, people who are already experts in the field, and you're trying to add something to what they know. Now, people get in trouble with this, especially I think in East Asia, because they're writing as junior people for senior people in the field. And there's a feeling, well, they already know the background to this, so I don't need to give all that information. I'll just write my new discovery. But as an editor, I want more readers than just a small group of specialists. I want a secondary audience, which is people who are interested in the topic but are not specialists. So I want a broader group of readers, but that secondary audience needs the background. Anyway, you write for a particular audience, and when you submit to a journal that serves that audience. Every manuscript that comes in goes through an initial editorial review. And the purpose of that review is to reject as many manuscripts as possible, which sounds really bad. And it's not that we don't want to publish you. It's just that journals receive so many manuscripts that we can't referee all of them. The Journal of Asian Studies in the US gets 400 submissions a year. Out of those 400, they will publish around 25. Now, every journal article, or at least in that journal, everyone has to be refereed at least by 2 referees. So if they refereed everything, that would be 800 reports. And most of those reports would be a waste of time for the person who wrote the report. And no journal can waste people's time like that and expect that the next time a referee will accept. So the first thing they have to do is weed out the articles that have no hope. And so let's say out of that 400, 200 have gone to completely the wrong journal. So you're down to 200. That's not even cutting it enough. So what do editors consider? Well, the first and obvious one is, does the topic fall within the scope of the journal? What question does the author answer? You're seeing the same thing come up that I was just saying a bit ago here. Is the question significant? What is the answer to the question? Who's going to read the piece? And is the author really qualified to write about this? Now, these are very basic questions. And how do we figure out the answers to them? Well, the initial screening is going to be based on the title, the abstract, the keywords, the introduction and conclusion, the headings, and then we also will consider the mechanics, that is, the citations, the bibliography. Because as professionals, you should know how to do those things. And if they are not well done, not properly done, that will be a mark against you. The next step, if you clear that initial hurdle, will be peer reviewed. But many articles don't clear that. They don't go to peer review. So it's good news for you if an article gets peer reviewed, because it means somebody has decided, yes, this is interesting, yes, it's important, yes, it's worth asking peers to review it. Okay, well, I've said that the title, the abstract, and keywords are something that editors are going to look at. And these are particularly important now, because with electronic publishing, I mean, everybody knows, you go online, you search for a topic, an article comes up, what are you going to see before you pay, or before you have to go to your university library and get access to it through the library? What you're going to see is those things, the title, the abstract, and the keywords. These are also things that are picked up by search engines. So it's important that you pick your keywords carefully. It's important that your abstract is a good abstract that will tell people what's in the article. And readers, coming back to that, we're looking for readers. Readers are going to decide whether or not to spend time on an article based on those three elements. So let's look at them. The title. It should include keywords. It should at least suggest what the argument is. It should position the material in time and place. And it should do something to attract readers. Now, given that the title is going to be 10 or 12 words, that's a pretty ambitious thing. And it means you need to spend time on your titles. You should avoid jargon. You shouldn't put obscure words. You shouldn't use clever or cute wordings. And you should not use unfamiliar abbreviations. So you want to say UN, that's fine, as long as you're talking about the United Nations. If you want to use KMT, that's probably fine. But it will depend a bit on your audience. But before you use an abbreviation, think about what audience you have picked, who are you writing for, and will they know what you're talking about. Then we come to the abstract. Now, an abstract is short. You probably have about 150 to 200 words. And some of you are probably sitting there thinking, oops, my abstract was 300 or 400, and I've noticed that. We'll talk about it. So an abstract should state the research topic. It should include the answer to your research question. It should indicate the significance of the research. And it should stand alone. In other words, if I read an abstract, it's almost like reading a mini version of the article. I won't know enough detail to do much with it, but I will pretty much know what the article does by reading the abstract. And if I don't, then the abstract isn't very good. I've noticed that about some of your abstracts too. An abstract should not try to describe the existing literature. It should not explain or criticize work by other writers. And it should not be filled with a lot of detail. For example, this is a bad abstract. This article will discuss topic A, B, and C. It should certainly not say, in this manuscript, I will attempt to show, or I will try to show. Because if you're still just trying to show something, you're not ready to write. What I want to see is, in this manuscript, I show. I demonstrate, I prove. I know you're being modest. This is not the time to be modest. I mean, don't go overboard, but if you haven't accomplished something, you really aren't ready to write your article. So what I'd rather see is, based on the study of A, B, and C, I conclude that, and then give me your outcome. Give me your conclusion. I like to tell the story of somebody that came to my office. He was a distinguished looking young scholar. Graduated from Peking University. He was teaching in Japan. And he came in with a book manuscript. And I looked at it and I said, well, you don't have an argument. You haven't put any kind of conclusion at the beginning. And, I want to see your conclusion. I don't know if I accept it until I look at your evidence. But I want to know where we're going with this. And he said, I can't do that. Why can't you do it? I said. This is very simple. If I give you my conclusion at the beginning, nobody's going to read the book. I said, you're not writing a murder mystery. I didn't persuade him. And this is also something we need to talk about, because one of the things that comes up when you look at rhetorical styles in East Asia is a sort of reluctance to start with that kind of information. It's more a question, okay, I'm going to give you some evidence, and now we're going to come to the conclusion. But as an editor, I can tell you, if you bury your conclusion, you may not ever really get a chance to present it. Keywords are designed to attract readers, that word again, and get articles into the search results. So what should they be? They should be specific. They should be targeted. When people put keywords in that could apply to 500,000 articles, and it doesn't do any good. Nationalism. Okay, it's a key word. How many articles do you suppose are out there about nationalism? So putting that as your keyword is not going to help anyone find your article. The keywords should be used frequently in the article. If you are using something like WHO, World Health Organization, put both of them, because somebody doing a search might look for the abbreviation, they might look for the whole name. And then after you've picked some keywords, do a search on them. Go to Google Scholar and do a search on the keyword you've used and find out, does that keyword bring up articles similar to your article? I'm going to hurry along as we do this, because you have the ones who are in the workshop have this on paper, so there's no need for me to spend a lot of time letting you write it down. I'm sorry for those of you who don't have it. So the headings. A good set of headings will outline an article. And what I often do is go through an article and just take out the headings, list them on a separate document, and then I just read the headings and ask myself, what do I understand now about this article, having read the headings? It should tell me how you are moving through a set of ideas. I'm moving from this to this to this. And is that making sense? So they will show how an author is grouping information or ideas. How an article proceeds step by step. And bear in mind that a lot of people reading your article are not going to start at the beginning and read all the way through it. People go in, dip into articles and read selectively. And it's good if you understand that and help them with your headings. Also, some people may be somewhat interested in your article because they're looking at related matters. So, okay, they read your headings, they get a sense of what you're doing. Maybe later they're going to want to come back and read in detail. But maybe not. Maybe it already helps them. Okay, here's an article that's dealing with this issue. I'm dealing with a related issue. That's all I need to know right now. It's not overlapping with mine exactly. So you can follow a discussion, but not read in detail. You then we come to the opening and closing paragraphs. And the opening paragraph is like starting a trip, saying, okay, our destination is this. I'm telling you at the beginning. And now I'm going to take you there. It should give the answer to your research question. Fundamentally, you're saying, this is my argument, now I'm going to show you the evidence. And the closing paragraph essentially completes the circle. It says, I began with this claim, with this argument. I've supported it with this type of evidence. And I think I've made my case. I was talking one day with the political scientist Jim Scott, and he was talking about how he organizes his work. And he said, I have three parts. The introduction, the body, the conclusion. In the introduction I say, this is what I'm going to say. In the body, this is me saying it. And the conclusion, this is what I said. And a little bit cynically he said, I hope that if I say it 3 times, the readers will get it at least once. I don't particularly think conclusions should say anything new. If you have new things to say, they should be presented in the body of the article. The conclusion just puts an end to what you're saying. Okay, the citations in bibliography. There are several standard formats. Most journals will pick one or the other. Most book publishers will accept whatever the author has used if it is one of the standard formats. The principal ones being footnotes or in-text citations. Don't mix them. The reason book publishers will accept either one is that if somebody has written a manuscript using one type of formatting, and you try to change that, it's a huge job and you're going to introduce mistakes. So generally a book publisher will accept whatever you have used. Journals and publishers have guidance. They have style sheets that are usually available on a web page. And if you're writing for a journal, you get hold of that, you read it, understand what they're asking for. Do you need a literature review? Well, a lot of you seem to think so because we got a lot of literature reviews. We're not so sure. For one thing, what is the purpose of an article? It's really a place where you're putting forward the new things that you have found. And what is a literature review? It's repeating things that other people have found. You do need to position your material, but you're positioning it mostly in the context of a set of ideas or concepts. And what's really annoying is where somebody focuses in a literature review on authors or titles. Okay, Professor so-and-so in this book said something, and this professor agreed with him, and this other professor disagreed, and so on. What works much better is that you focus on concepts. So just to take a simple example, the focus of studies on nationalism has shifted from ideology and group loyalty to print capitalism. And then you cite Benedict Anderson. Critics have pointed out, so you're focusing on the ideas, and then you give the citation to the person that came up with the idea. But you're not focusing on the article or the author, but focusing on the idea. And you only do this with things that are relevant to your own work. You're positioning what you have to say within a broader literature. Now, Let's talk about peer review. Universities value peer-reviewed publications. I'm sure you all know that. Now, I talked about the preliminary screening, and I didn't say much about content at that point, because an editor probably is not going to worry too much about the content. It's more about the presentation. And just to take my own attitude toward this, I am an academic, a researcher, not just a publisher. There are certain topics that I know quite a bit about. Generally speaking, if somebody has written on those topics, I will try not to evaluate it. For a couple of reasons, but one of them is that in my field, I know just about everybody. And if somebody has written an article and somebody I know, it's really much better that I am not the reviewer. Because somebody's going to say, oh, you're just publishing that because that person's your friend. Very bad for me, very bad for the journal. So I'm going to rely on external people to look at the content. I'll look at the way it's presented, I'll look at the structure. But I will try not to pass judgment on the content, unless it really looks terrible, and then I'll say it's terrible. So the peer review is evaluating the content, the data. It's also evaluating how the information is used, and it will be looking at the contribution made by the manuscript. Now for international refereed journals, there's a minimum of 2 reviews, and some journals will take more, they'll look for 3 or 4. Most reviews are done on a double-blind basis, which means that the author doesn't know the reviewer or who the reviewer is, and the reviewer doesn't know who the author is. It works in some fields. In others, they're small fields. I used to use a specialist in Thai studies for articles on Thailand. Every single time, he wrote back and said, I know who wrote that. To which my reaction was always, well, of course you do. You're on top of the field. You know who's doing what. Of course you know. And he was very fair. And just to give you the other side of this, you also get people who respond to referees' reports by saying, I know who did that. That person has been trying to sabotage my career for years. And I'll just tell you right now, every time somebody has said that to me, every time, they've gotten it wrong. But I can't tell them because then the next thing they'll do is guess right. You also need to understand that English language peer review is an adversarial process. What the reviewers are doing is testing for weakness. They're challenging what you've done. And part of the goal is to reject poor articles. Part of the goal is to improve articles that have prospects. But you need to expect a review that is going to feel harsh. And it's not because the reviewer is a bad person or you're a bad person. It's not because they're unhappy with you. It's just that they have been told weak articles are not good for the author, they're not good for the journal. And if you find weakness, it has to be fixed. Okay, here's some sample questions that we asked reviewers. And they're very similar to things that I've mentioned before, but what is the contribution? How does it change what was known? What's the argument? Does the author support the argument? Are the sources appropriate? Is the writing clear? Did you find errors? And what do you recommend? Now, the reviewers always recommend something. Oh, this is not acceptable, or this should be accepted. As an editor, I am not bound by what the referee says. Referees usually recommend one of three things: accept with minor revisions, revise and resubmit, or reject. If referees disagree, what will happen? Well, we being editors, we have a standard response to that, which is, oh yeah, we'll probably get a third report. It's not always true. Reports differ quite a lot. Some reports strike you as really thorough. Somebody has really engaged with the article. Some reports, you think, this person skimmed through the article, they haven't taken it very seriously. So it depends not just on what the report says, but how persuasive it is. Now we might call for a third report. Almost always you're going to be asked to revise and resubmit. And editors differ on how much they're going to tell you. But ideally they will tell you quite a lot. They'll tell you this is what is really important in those reports. Here are some ideas, the rest of it is ideas you might think about, but if you do it or not, that's up to you. If an editor has not communicated that, if an editor has just sent back a report and said, well, here, take a look at it. First thing you should do is write back and say, okay, I've looked at it. This is my reaction to it. What do you think is important here? And if the editor is not engaging with you about that, there could be a problem. But ideally, the editor will talk to you. So why are manuscripts rejected? There's a whole string of things coming up here. Sometimes there's good data, but no argument. Sometimes there's an argument, but not any support, or not enough. Sometimes the author has spent too much time explaining the research problem, or fails to explain the significance of the work. The analysis may be inadequate. Maybe there's not any use of theory. Maybe the conclusions are not spelled out. Another problem that is pervasive in some of the papers here. Sometimes the text doesn't proceed logically. Now, as an author, I will sit down and write several paragraphs, few pages of a manuscript, and I finish, and it just feels brilliant. I have put it together so nicely. This to this to this to this to this. And I put it on my desk, and I go to bed, and I get up the next morning, and I read it, and it is so illogical. It is so bad. But it made so much sense when I did it. Well, it's kind of a stream of consciousness thing. And then I start pulling it apart. And people sometimes say to me, well, I've revised this manuscript 5 times. And it seems like a lot, except that everything I've ever published, I have revised heavily at least 25 or 30 times. And everything I've ever published, I could sit down and do it another 10 times, reorganizing and so on. But at some point, diminishing returns, and you just say, okay, that's it, done. Okay, more reasons. Internal contradictions. When the referee writes back and says, well, if you look at page 5 of the manuscript, the author says this, but on page 7, the author says just the opposite. It's not good news for the manuscript. The background and context are not sufficient. There's not been enough citation of relevant previous work. The data is either too little or too much. This is a big problem because in an article, you cannot give all of your data. So you have to be selective. You have to give enough data to persuade people that, yes, you know what you're talking about. Yes, this is going to support the argument. If you put too much data, you probably are losing people in all the detail. I'm going to talk about this again. On 2 days from now, we'll have a session on ethics. And this will come up again in that discussion. Sometimes there are too many digressions or too much irrelevant detail. And I could probably make another list of reasons that's equally long. There are just so many reasons that manuscripts get turned down. But fundamentally, whatever the reason that's given, the referee is saying it doesn't do the job. It's just not an article. And I don't find this at all in the papers here, but sometimes you do have people who spend a lot of time criticizing other scholars. If you are challenging a scholar, of course you're criticizing that person. But fundamentally, you're not criticizing the individual, you're challenging the individual's ideas. So focus on that, and don't make it personal. Now, the referee's reports usually will include suggested changes. And the editor should tell you something about which are important. But bear in mind, every time a referee has brought up something, the referee has stumbled over something. And so your problem here is, maybe it's just a matter of how I said it. It's not that the idea is wrong, but I haven't made it clear. So you may need to change the way you're saying something. You may not have to change what you're saying. Thank you. You can discuss changes with the editor. You can disagree with the editor. You can disagree with the referees. But you have to be ready to defend your position. And the editor may disagree with you. Ultimately, the editor is going to be the one to decide, am I accepting this or not? Usually an editor will say, this is the schedule I want you to follow for revision. Maybe you're teaching, maybe you have a problem, you can talk about that, but don't ignore it. Look up the house style of the journal and use that. You'll have to deal with copyright for photographs, quotations. Now, you're entitled to use short excerpts as quoted material so long as it's cited. But anything that is a photograph, a chart, or a graph from some other source is probably under copyright, and if you want to use it, you have to do something about that. The journal is not responsible for that. You're responsible. And remember this, at the end of the process, something is going to get published, and it is going to be there for the rest of your career. It's your manuscript, it's your article. You need to say what you want to say. It's not the editor's and it's not the referee's article, it's yours. So be sure that what you're saying is your ideas. It is what you want to get across. Contracts. Back when I started out, I sent an article off to a journal. They either accepted it or rejected it. If they accepted it, they would send me a note saying, okay, we're going to publish it. And they would publish it. That was it. Simple. Nowadays, journals will send out an agreement. And that agreement will probably include a statement from you that you are the author, that you own the material in that article. And you are giving permission to the journal to publish it. Terrible world we live in, so legalistic. So with the journal or with the book, you have two options, and you don't have the option, the publisher has the option. They can ask for the copyright to be transferred, or they can ask you to sign an agreement that says, I give you exclusive right to publish this material. Now, most journals are going to allow authors to publish or to post the final version of an article on a personal website or even upload it to social media sites. Most journals will not allow authors to publish or to post the published version of record. The version of record is the one that has been typeset by the journal. Now, the exception to this, of course, is open access material. But so far as a journal that you sign an agreement with, you promise that you will behave yourself in terms of who gets to see that version of record. You can post your manuscript, the final version even, but not the copy edited and laid out version used in the journal. And just to anticipate something that will come up in the ethics section, if you are sending material off to Academia EDU or to ResearchGate, you are doing something illegal. If you read, nobody reads the fine print. When you sign up for these sites, you sign an agreement with the site. You should read it. Because one of the provisions in the Academia EDU site is everybody who posts something is saying, by posting it, they own the material. They have the right to post it. If you sign an agreement with a publisher, you don't own it anymore. If the publisher ever sues Academia EDU, you read again on that agreement, you indemnify Academia EDU. So if Academia EDU is sued by a publisher, they're going to say, oh, well, we had nothing to do with this. The author told us the author had the right to do it. So you will be sued. Read the agreements. It also gives Academia EDU a pretty much unlimited right to reuse your material. You should pay attention to that one too. Okay, now I'm going to bring up some issues that are associated with Asian authors. I'm not bringing these things up because I expect you to agree with them all. I'm sure some of this will seem familiar to you. But this is a collection of things that I have found in journals that deal with writing in a second language, with rhetorical styles, argumentation styles, found primarily in East Asian languages. So, the first thing we're going to talk about, and this is not controversial, matters of language. People often say, well, my English is not very good, and so that's a problem. Mostly it's not, because you're not being asked to write in a very elaborate style. What we really are looking for is an expression of your idea. So just write simply, write clearly. Each discipline has a vocabulary and a presentation style associated with it. And if you're studying in that discipline, one of the things you need to learn is how people in sociology, political science, present articles, how they express their ideas. Often I run into people who have used commercial editing firms. Okay, first off, many of them outsource work to other countries, particularly India. The results of that are very mixed. We did a workshop in Japan a couple of years ago, and there were two women there, lawyers, and they had both outsourced articles, well, both sent them to commercial editing firms. And they'd gotten back the articles, and they had submitted them, and they were rejected because the language wasn't good. And they said, well, one of them paid $500, one said, well, I was late, I paid $1,000. And then they were rejected. I have a friend in Japan who said, you know the problem, one of the problems with this editing is young Japanese girls who have foreign boyfriends. I said, what does that have to do with it? Well, it's very simple. These boyfriends come to Japan, they sign on with editing firms, and so you send an article to the commercial firm, they give it to the boyfriend, because he's trying to make some money to stay in Japan that way. But they're not editors. They're probably native speakers, but that's about it. Even if the results of commercial editing are competent, that is accurate, they may not read very well. They're not reading as smoothly as you would want. And then what about turning to a friend who is a native speaker? A lot of people do that. Well, generally speaking, a native speaker can help some with grammar. Very few of these friends are trained editors. And honestly, many native speakers don't write very well. Okay, then argumentation. Well, I began saying arguments are really at the heart of scholarly articles. And social-cultural norms are going to affect the style of argumentation. So the sort of issues that come up, direct versus indirect presentations. In other words, you come out and give your argument and then support it, which is what I'm basically saying you ought to do. Or do you come at it indirectly? Do you use inductive or deductive reasoning? You start with your data and then work up to a conclusion, or do you start with your conclusion and then support it? Do you place your argument or your thesis statement at the end of a text or at the beginning? Do you avoid contentious statements in order to avoid confrontation, to minimize confrontation? Or do you maybe not even state the argument explicitly, just present the material and leave it to the reader to decide what to make of it? Now you can figure out what these articles are suggesting is the style of Asian rhetoric in this. And like I said, I don't know that you're going to agree with this, but this is what is coming out of the literature. The use of history and tradition to support claims. The use of a reference to authority, whether it's an academic authority, a political authority, to support a statement, as opposed to finding empirical data. The use of analogies and metaphors as evidence. Stating opinions or beliefs that are not based on evidence, or not evidence that's been presented. And then there's the question of passive voice. Now this is something that occurs in every Asian country I've been in. Now, my own language is Indonesian and Malay, and it's full of passive voice. So what's wrong with passive voice? I get asked this fairly often. So just compare this. Passive voice. The candidate was accused of corruption. What's missing? Who made the accusation? So let's look at it a slightly different way. The candidate's ex-wife accused him of corruption. Well, he may or may not be corrupt, but certainly the fact that the accusation comes from the ex-wife is a significant piece of information. You need to be saying who did what to whom, not just that something happened. And then there's something, this one is very tricky, because people keep insisting, well, we don't do this anymore. And so I just put it on the screen and leave it to you to decide whether you do it or even know about it. There's a four-part construction that appears in classical literature. It's found in Japan, it's found in China, and it's found in Korea. And the third part, if you're using this, is going to be troublesome. Because the third part looks like it doesn't belong until you get to the conclusion when suddenly everything falls in place. So I just mentioned this, and if you want to talk about it later, that's fine. If you've never heard of it, you probably enjoy looking it up. Finally, a few general bits of advice. I mentioned journal guidelines. Pay attention to the length that a publisher asks for. Most journals are suggesting 6,000 to 8,000 words. Some go up to 10,000. If you send in a 14,000 word article, the chances are pretty good nobody's even going to look at it. It's too long. Back. Sloppiness is going to hurt you. If you send a manuscript in that's full of typographical errors, spelling mistakes, it's going to hurt your chances, because if you don't care enough about your material to clean it up, why should I care? And especially because Microsoft Word is going to put little squiggly lines under anything that, most everything at least, that looks wrong. Pay attention to the appropriateness of your topic for an article. If I get a piece on the Asian financial crisis of 1998, I don't think anybody can explain that in 6,000 words. It's too big. If you have images, use low-resolution images when you submit your article or your book manuscript. We'll need high-resolution images for publication. But high-resolution images take up an enormous amount of space. It's very hard to maneuver them. And when you put an image into a Word document, it gets degraded. It can't be used in the final publication. So you need to make a low-resolution image, stick it in so we can see what the illustration is. But in the final version, anything that you're bringing in from, as a photograph, say you want a JPEG file, anything that comes from the Excel file, you submit it as an Excel file. Don't just stick it into your Word document. If you created a table using the facility in Word, that's okay. It's the Excel files that are brought in that are going to be a bit troublesome. What you do in the manuscript is you say, table, whatever it is, about here. So when there's layout being done, the layout person will know I have to pull a table and put it in at this point. But when an article is laid out, they're not using Word. They're using specialized programs. Remove the comments. Once in a while I open up a manuscript and suddenly the screen is bright red because somebody has tracked changes and they've left every single change and every single comment. You need to accept the changes, turn off track changes. Don't waste time with fancy typefaces. Don't spend any time at all on artistic layout. If I get that, what I will do is change everything to 12-point Times Roman and be done with it. You've wasted your time and wasted a bit of mine. Do not put 2 spaces after a full stop, a period, or a colon. Typewriters, you did that. An amazing number of people who never used a typewriter are still doing it on a computer. And I have personally destroyed an enormous number of spaces. Because if I get an article like that, what I do is a global search and replace. 2 spaces replaced with 1. And I get manuscript, I have destroyed 800 spaces or 1,200 spaces. And every time I do this, I think, you know, the author who did this probably has carpal tunnel syndrome from going tap, 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 tap. And it took me 10 seconds to wipe them all out. This has to do with proportional spacing. Typewriters, every single thing. A period, an I, an N, and M occupy the same amount of space. So people put 2 spaces after the periods so you could tell that's the end of a sentence. Computers use proportional spacing, which means the space is taken up by a period is less than an N is less than an M. Don't do this 2-space thing. Most of you haven't, by the way, which is nice. So, here's a bunch of references. I'm happy to answer questions along the way. So, thank you very much for your attention. I think we have a bit of time, so floor is open if anyone wants to question, object, complain. Yeah. We need a microphone, so.
No, it's okay. This one's working.
Okay.
So, well, that was a great lecture indeed. And much of it sounded too familiar because I recently read a book. The book's name was The Scientist's Guide to Writing. It's written by Stephen Hurd. I'm not sure if some of the material was inspired by that, but it all sounded too familiar. And that was wonderful. It's bad in no way. Coming to the question, the first thing that I wanted to ask was that you portrayed academia.edu as a negative way, that they may use your material in X, Y, or Z way. What I'm concerned is that isn't that good for me if they're going to publicize that in multiple places, and if I'm a first author on the paper, aren't they going to say that this person or the research conducted by this showed this? Isn't that good for me in a way?
Let me just respond to that first.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, academia EDU is probably not going to use it themselves, but they can. Secondly, it can be good for you that more people read your paper. It's just illegal.
So, at the end of the day, it's still good for me, isn't it?
Okay, it's also unethical. No,
but do people really have that much time to pursue, do these big companies really have that much time to pursue a single person that they've violated a copyright claim?
Well, Elsevier has issued takedown notices in the past. So they do have it, but no, realistically, probably nothing's going to happen. What I would ask you to pay attention to, there are new sites being created that will do the same thing, but legally. They're sort of in the early stage now, but the Modern Language Association in the US, for example, has one. There's some in the sciences. The thing that, a lot of academics would say exactly what you're saying, which is, okay, I put it out there, people read it, I'm not getting paid for it anyway, so it doesn't matter to me, and if more people read it, isn't that good? And that's why those sites have flourished. But do bear in mind, who's paying for these sites, do you know?
No.
Yeah, well, they're run by finance capitalists. And why would somebody put a lot of money into running a site like that? Well, it's basically about data mining. And again, that probably doesn't hurt you individually. Although I know some of the people who put their articles up there, they're saying, well, I want to break away from the capitalist stranglehold on publishing, by companies like Springer and Elsevier, so I'll put it up there so everybody can read it. Well, you're just jumping from one hot pan to another hot pan. Because these sites are being run by people who are, it's commercial, they're doing it for money. Academia EDU is not properly an EDU site. They got the designation before the criteria were tightened up. So if they started right now, they could not be an EDU site. So you just need to be aware of the nature of the beast, I guess. Did you have another question?
Yeah, the second one is that, the second one actually pertains to the way that we're presenting the paper. And one of the rules that you presented is that it's better to write in active voice than in passive voice. Now, I don't work with the humanities or social sciences. I'm a cancer biologist. And in many ways, the way that we present the data, it actually sounds more interesting when we write it in passive voice. And some of the books that I've read on academic writing, They say it actually doesn't matter as long as you maintain consistency. If you're writing in passive voice, then just maintain the consistency, and if you're writing in active voice, follow that throughout your paper. But I guess the more important thing is that we need to express the data in a more interesting way. So if writing it in a passive voice makes it sound like that or look like that, isn't that the right thing to do?
Susan, let me go first, then you go. I think there are a couple of answers to that. One is it depends whether it matters who the actor is. And in some disciplines, and the kind of thing you're talking about, it probably doesn't matter. So the passive voice is all right. I don't see the point about consistency, though. That wouldn't particularly matter, I don't think. But the question about whether to use active voice or passive voice, what I was saying, I wouldn't say is a rule. It's a suggestion, but it would apply more to humanities, social sciences.
Just to add something to that. First of all, that's not a rule. You can do it if you want to, or you don't have to. Although in some disciplines, that's more popular or more frequently used than others. As you said, if you come from the hard sciences, that's the tendency to do that. Because when you use a passive voice, you're not focusing on who the doer of the action is. You're focusing on the action. If you want to do that, that when you're talking about a procedure, the beans are fermented, okay, then that works okay. But I think this is coming from, sometimes you're overusing it because you don't want to focus on the action, on the actor, when you should.
It's actually quite obvious of the actor is when we're writing a paper, we're saying we, so it's a safe assumption that...
Yeah, but not everybody's sensitive to that. Because I think that's coming from the fact that you don't want to identify who did it.
Well, again, in your discipline, I think it probably doesn't matter so much.
I think that might be, that's the tradition, or that's the practice, or the accepted practice. But, you know what, again, but I go back to the original point. These rules, I'm dealing with the language aspect of writing, these rules are not really imperatives. If you want to use it, fine, you can. But do know what the impact of you writing an article or a text that's mostly using passive voice when it's not necessary.
Well, also understand that in humanities and social sciences, editors react badly to it. Again, you're not in those fields, so it's not going to...
I understand. That's why I clarified that in the beginning.
Yeah.
But as an editor, and I'm guessing you're in academics as well, but do you, when you see a passive voice, do you think of it in a negative way? That this guy doesn't know how to write?
If I see one or two, no. If I see a lot of them, yes.
That'll be all. Thank you so much.
Well, also, beyond that, people overuse the verb to be. And you really need to, I mean, again, in your field, I don't think this applies, but there's too much of using, oh, there was, there is, just not an interesting way, because you can say these things in ways that have much more impact. Okay, let's just do 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we'll start on the side. Good.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I found it extremely helpful.